Well, one thing I've learned from studying military history is that one of the most unrealistic things you can do in military science fiction is have a competent president or a overly competent commanding general.
Right.
Drop troopers fall through an endless sky. Military sound and science fiction contest. Reaction in the system on fire. Military sound and science fiction contest. Short stories every Wednesday. Military sound and fiction contest. Discussion, interviews, reviews, and rants. Military sound and science fiction contest.
All right. Welcome to the show. Today we are talking about history or using historical events as a basis for military science fiction. And y'all have to help remind me so we can make sure we touch on this. But both grand scale transitional battles that you would use probably when mapping out a whole story, and then smaller stories that could be used as sort of like a side quest or something if you're just looking for cool things for characters to do. But also sometimes history is weirder than fiction. So how do we make it believable that an actual historical event would make sense in a story? So Josh, I think you had an example to start to kick off with that you used in Strikers War. You want to talk about that?
Yeah. So we were talking about like the major events in military history, battles and wars, and I think we could probably all agree that the majority of I won't say the majority, but a lot of military sci-fi takes inspiration from like World War II or Vietnam, and in kind of recent years more of Iraq and Afghanistan kind of thing, in terms of how the theater of war plays out. I like to take inspiration from smaller events on kind of a personal soldier level. And so for Stryker's War, it was written in the Galaxy's Edge universe, and the theme of the Order of the Centurion series books was basically the Order of the Centurion was the Medal of Honor for the now I can't even remember can't remember what the military unit is called, um, the Legion. That was their Medal of Honor. And so what I did was I went through all of the Medal of Honor winners from U.S. history and found Dakota Meyer's story and read into that and watched a number of interviews with him. And I loosely based some of the events on Stryker's War on some of Dakota Meyer's firsthand accounts of his battle and how he earned the Medal of Honor. And I like really taking some of those personal aspects of war and incorporating them into the story. Not only do I feel like it gives a little bit of credibility to the writing itself, but if other obviously those events are shared between multiple people and across services and different battles, and so a lot of those stories, it doesn't matter whether they take place in World War II or Iraq and Afghanistan. On a personal level, all of those soldiers and war fighters on some level have kind of experienced the same thing and experienced the same kind of emotions and different things. And so regardless of the era of military that you served in, if you're reading these books, if I can get those situations and scenarios as close to real life as possible in terms of just impact, then they'll resonate a lot with the veterans that are the readers. And even the readers that aren't veterans, that it'll give them kind of an insight or maybe a taste of what that scenario was like in real life. And I don't know that I in the book, I don't know that I had like an afterword or anything that said, "Hey, this is based on Dakota Myers stuff." But I think that I wrote it in such a way that if you were familiar with his story, you could see the link there and the connection there, and kind of trying to pay homage to a guy that was put in a really bad spot and overcame and did what he needed to do to save his guys and to help his guys out. And I think that's important.
And he was only a corporal when that action took place. So that, I think, is another talking about bringing it close. I don't know, just close soldier actions that anybody could be a hero.
Well,
I think is pretty.
well,
Cool.
and that's the thing too. Like a lot of we all want to write that main character that does really heroic things and really steps up to the plate and goes above and beyond, and that tends to be a lot of the focal point of the story. And I think that taking inspiration from real life and paying homage to those heroes is a cool thing, and we get the ability and the opportunity to do that, and I don't know that I'll ever be in a position to thank Dakota Meyer for what he did for those soldiers over there and for his guys, but being able to kind of pay homage to him in a certain way made me feel good about it, in my own little kind of small way.
You have lots of readers, Josh. Big way. I am, so funny is I remember being in this Western civilization class, years ago, and they really had a great history professor. He's actually a fan of my work now, so this is really nice. His name was Reggie Jane, Professor Fabulous Hair. And I actually consult with him every once in a while, too, when I have a particular bit of history that I need to make sure I get right. But one of the things that we were talking about in the class is that most of the ancient historical events people don't really have a record for. There's no real firsthand accounts. And one example people love to bring up as something that didn't happen was Horatius at the bridge. Because it's unbelievable that one man could stand on a bridge and fend off an entire army, for as long as he did. To my counterpoint, which is, it is unbelievable that a man could land a plane on a river, land a jet on a river with no engines, no power, in the middle of winter, and have nobody die. It is completely unbelievable. Yet it has happened. Or It's also unbelievable that one guy in the open could walk into gunfire, being shot at by multiple sources, and take out all of his opponents and not be shot at all. Yet, that happened. Wyatt Earp, when he killed Curly Bill. That big famous gunfight. Coke was shot like 27 times. Or that George Washington would have 3 horses shot out from underneath him in one battle. And Raleigh.
He was going up against a bunch of Brits who really hated horses.
Yeah. Well, no, it was actually before he was before he was a general, was when he was a major. And then Raleigh broken troops to form a line, after they were already retreating. So it's like there's the truth is stranger than fiction, right? And so a lot of times you get into reading events
when real people have plot armor.
Yeah, when real people have main character energy, right? Is that what everybody's saying now? That was my daughter. But it's kind of funny. You look at history, like Audie Murphy, right? Stands on a burning tank, calling in artillery on his own position while shooting 50 cal. Doesn't die. I remember reading a story, an interview with him, and he said that Paramount made him cut a bunch of stuff from the movie to hell and back because they said that nobody would believe that actually happened. And he's like, but everything in that movie happened exactly as we filmed it, which is crazy.
And I think that's a big part of the challenge there, because that's some of the feedback you always get from people that also don't know history. And if you try and, use the argument that like, well, it happened that way. Okay, well, as a writer using this as my baseline, how do I set this up in a way that is still awesome and pays homage to the story, but how can I explain, how they could have made that happen, or how do I set that character up to be believable that way? I mean, Audie Murphy certainly earned. I don't know. I feel like Audie Murphy, that didn't just happen to him out of nowhere. He was a guy that was just an amazing soldier. So it's a little bit more.
it's
nothing happens
crazy
in the vacuum,
the
right?
kind
You
of
got to set everything up.
He was very
it's
short,
interesting
so
the
he was very
kind of
short, so he had a small
juxtaposition
strike zone.
between stuff that like we're talking about that's kind of unbelievable, and like Audie Murphy's thing, like, oh, that didn't happen or that couldn't happen, and then juxtapose that to the stuff that is not believable, that as veterans we read or we watch and we're like, that didn't happen like that, or we watch a movie and like, that's not plausible, and the majority of people are like, oh yeah, that makes sense, but then you put in something real that actually is a thing and they're like, that couldn't happen, and it's just interesting the the way that sometimes that, where I watched a movie on Netflix a while back, and I can't remember what it was called, but it was a kind of a military movie with the Helmsworth that wasn't Thor, and they
Liam,
had this
Liam,
bomber. Yeah, they had this bomber at the end of the movie that was coming in to run a strafing run, and it was a B two. No, the Lancer. Is that the B1? It wasn't the stealth bomber. It was the other one.
B1 is the Lancer.
Yeah, okay. So it had to have been the B1, but they were flying it like a F-16. They weren't like way up high in the air like it would be flying. Everybody's like, "Oh yeah, that's the coolest thing ever." And I'm like, "Yeah, but that's not real. that wouldn't happen."
B1s
They
can
do,
also
they
do
do fly it ape of the earth, but I don't think they fly it, fighter style.
B1s
Yeah.
B1s can do low level bombing. They perform very well in low levels. I've seen them at air shows being
Yeah, that's what the
flown.
wings are for. Yeah,
And
but I
they've
mean,
also
like, they're not
they also,
fighters.
they also did some low level bombing in Afghanistan.
You're absolutely right. But the way that they were portraying it in that movie was it not accurate to
Yeah.
real life. Anyway, that's off topic.
Or like
You're
executive
just in the Air
decision
Force.
where they're
What do you
like,
mean?
they use the
Yeah.
F-117 as like a cargo plane, and like it comes up underneath
right.
Oh yeah.
the jet, and there's like 16 soldiers inside the Nighthawk, and they all climb out. And
I'll forgive that because
Oh,
Steven Seagal dies, so that's.
I was gonna say, Executive Decision, such a great movie, but that beginning of that was kind of ridiculous.
it's like, I don't think that's how stealth fighters work.
That was
Right.
definitely rule of cool.
Yes, rule of cool.
And so when you're writing, when you take, like, so for instance, so if you read my books, the book 3, Decisive Victory is, or as it is in German, just Decisive Victory for some reason. The entire book is based off of that Filipino raid. What's it called? Cabanan? I don't know how to say it in Filipino. But the entire book is based off that idea of like going behind enemy lines with yourself, with no supply lines, no QRF, no reinforcements, and rescuing people who are going to be killed. And while there's a lot of, like, I didn't follow the raid step by step. Like, there was no, like, it's not a 1-for-1 analogy. It was I read everything I could about the Great War, and then used as much of that as I could, in the context of, okay, the ship's going to go behind enemy lines and attack this enemy planet, rescue all the hostages on the planet that they can, and get out. And then add in all this other stuff that happens. And a lot of my books, I won't say, I don't think I have anything that's a 1-for-1 analogy, despite what that review in Analog Magazine said about my books being a 1-for-1 analogy for the Russian-Ukraine conflict. Even though they were written 2 years before it started. Almost all of them are inspired by historical events. East Indian Trade Company. The way the way the British handled its what do they call them? Protectorates. The way we handle our protectorates. All the way to the way we did patrols in World War II, and the kind of naval functions we did and missions we did. Stuff like that. So, I mean, like, I take a huge inspiration from history, because I find that when you're using history as your basis for what you're doing, there's a lot of little details you don't necessarily have to give, just because people are picking up on, like, the general flow of what you're doing. Like, everybody has a general level of knowledge of history, and they understand that, like, okay, country A and country B are in conflict with each other, I don't have to explain why I have patrols, from country A around the territory that country B is in. And I like that. I like using history as the basis for just about everything I do, because the more things change, the more they stay the same. If you look at soldiers and Roman soldiers and what they did and what American soldiers do today, it's the equipment's different, but the attitudes and the things that they do are the same.
And typically it makes sense. I mean, we're talking about a lot of like really heroic battles where sometimes you wonder like how that happened, but in general, like I guess that's the whole point of, a military mindset, is that you do things in a way that that make sense and are effective, and you know that's typically how warfare has played out. We do things in a at least on the U.S. side, we do things in a specific way because we want to win. So it's the times, I guess, when those things didn't play out, like you didn't have the right logistics, which is something we've talked about before, like where you don't have all the things that you plan on, that things really get interesting, I guess, or gets where heroicism really comes into play. Um, so Rick, what I think you've definitely used history in your novels as well. Can you talk about some ways or things that you've thought about when putting stories together?
I use history, but I don't. I try not to use like the I don't know what you call it. I try not to use the outline of an actual battle and just put it in space or in the future, because I'm also very big on the idea that technology will severely affect the way we fight battles and the reasons we fight them for. But like the battle for Mars in the Droptrooper universe, that's Pearl Harbor basically. It's the sneak attack that they try to take out our capital ships before the war starts. That kind of thing. And like Jeff, the Cabanatuan raid, the Sante raid. There's been a lot of inspirations for missions that are to rescue prisoners of war or hostages, and I've used that several times in different military science fiction books. In particular, also I use in an adaptive way some of the tactics of the bombing campaigns of World War II. Not any particular battle, but like I use like the bombing campaign for the Ploeste oil fields in Yugoslavia during World War II as a kind of a, not really an outline, but kind of just a pattern for these what I call missile cutters in the drop trooper universe that are like the equivalent of long range bombers.
And a lot of it makes sense too. Like if you look at like the pattern of how things are built, right? So if you're going to have a transportation hub, the transportation hub is going to need power, and that's going to be hydroelectric or nuclear or whatever. I mean, yeah, we're changing the technology and it's on a different world, but the strategies are all going to be the same. You have to deny the enemy power. You have to deny the enemy logistics, and so it makes a lot of sense to use those.
I mean, there's also there's basic tactics that you learn in any military history class or studying history of things like double envelopment. I mean, like that was a big thing in my military history classes in ROTC was Cannae and cowpens is the double envelopment, So you learn stuff like that, and you use that in battles without specifically referencing those particular situations.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. That, like Rick said, the technology changes, but the idea is going to remain the same. And if you're looking at doing a specific type of mission, there's bound to be examples of that in real world history that you can look to and extrapolate like what the new challenges would be, or the hangups or the pitfalls or whatever. And sometimes those are in my opinion, more fun to kind of take those examples and run with it than trying to come up with something out of whole cloth almost, because if you just creating a situation of whole cloth, sometimes I feel like in my own writing that leads to a lot of easy button writing, where because you're creating a problem, it's very easy for you to create the antagonistic forces and then coming up with ways to defeat them and all of that. But pulling from history where you can see like these are the problems and this is how somebody else dealt with it, if you're kind of extrapolating from that, then you have to do a little bit of kind of mental gymnastics to say, if you're tweaking this aspect of it, how would you defeat it with your current technology or whatever you're using? Sometimes that's a little bit more interesting than trying to come up with your own problems. For me anyway, I think.
Honestly, when we're talking about technology, I mean, there's certain levels, right? We're not talking about like first order technology where they have a planet that shoots laser beam at sublight visible
For
speed,
sure, yeah.
crosses the galaxy instantly, and vaporizes all their enemies. You know,
that would be fantasy.
Yeah, that'd be fantasy. You know, obviously you can have a level of technology where all of these problems are not a problem. Oh, just beam all the guys out. You know, boom, problem solved. Which is why the transporter was always breaking in Star Trek. So you have to have a level of technology where that these problems are actual problems. Because if you try to present a hostage rescue as a problem and you've got transporter technology, it's not really a problem. You know,
unless they have some kind of defensive shield that blocks your transporter beams.
Well, that's the thing. You can have what you think is an easy button and then thwart it in some way.
I would like to
always have to thwart it. I just want to point that out. You always have to thwart it.
I would like to point out that in the original series has one of the best uses of history, military history, that I've seen in science fiction, and also that was in The Wrath of Khan, was the whole submarine warfare in the Balance of Terror, the submarine warfare parallels, and also in The Wrath of Khan. Just great use of some. There's a book by Glenn Cook, A Passage at Arms, it's called. Glenn Cook is famous for writing the Black Company military fantasy novels, but A Passage at Arms is science fiction. And he posits a universe where we're fighting this enemy and everybody has like hyperspace, you know, but the difference between his hyperspace and one you usually see like in Star Wars is you can actually fight each other in hyperspace. So if you get close enough to someone in hyperspace, you can fight them, and it happens. So he has a vessel called a climber, which climbs up into a higher dimension than hyperspace, which you can't actually get anywhere faster in that dimension, but you also can't be touched by the same kind of normal weapons. And you climb and you use like some kind of gravitational weapon to destroy other ships, but they can also, you have like a micro singularity that leaves a signature on the quote unquote surface of hyperspace, and they can hit that with gravitational weapons and shake you to pieces like depth charges, you know? And it was a really, really cool book that with submarine warfare. And the main problem you have in those climbers was heat buildup, because you can't shed heat like you can in hyperspace. So you can only stay in that whatever they called it, I can't remember, for so long before you have to come out. It's like a sub with air, you know. It was a really cool parallel for submarine warfare.
What's funny is every once in a while I'll get a review that says something like, "This is your books, your spaceship battles are too much like submarine warfare. That's not realistic in space." And I'm like, well, let's see. You're in an environment you can't see anything. You know, you don't have a lot of directional control, and you know, weapons are fired from beyond visual range. I don't know. It seems like submarine warfare to me, but I don't know. Some people have it in their heads that in space everything is going to be more like surface warfare for some reason. I don't know. It's always, to me, it always seemed natural idea is submarine warfare, you know?
Well, we can blame Star Wars for that. I mean, the whole idea that it's going to be dogfights in space is has set up this completely wrong expectation.
I love dogfights in space. It's really cool visually, but like you try to write it, and all of a sudden, it doesn't make a lot of sense.
Mhm.
Well, it takes a lot of technological twisting and rearrangement of the laws of physics to make it make sense. But I mean, it is really cool in some spots. I mean, like in the Holy War series, I made a point of, we had fighters because they came in handy against criminals who are using converted cargo vessels, that didn't have a lot of range. But now we're fighting this enemy that's same technology or even a little better than ours. They make no sense at all, and they get destroyed a lot. And by the end of the series, you're like, oh, we're not going to have these anymore.
Well, and I like the idea of the fighter-based combat as kind of like Babylon 5 kind of did it fun, where they were able to, and even Battlestar Galactica, where they weren't like P-51s and zeros flying around like that, but they could, change direction on a dime, but they still kind of had to deal with inertia and all that kind of stuff. But
yeah, those were great physically. I mean, they obeyed the laws of physics. They were great designs.
Yeah, but I also like the idea of like the different instead of just having a whole bunch of TIE fighters attacking, that you have like stealth bombers and different things like that, and those things would be hard to track for capital ships, and just interesting levels of what I call kind of quasi-realism, where you're if you want to have that kind of thing, setting up circumstances or technology that supports it. Like if the stealth bombers you can track them visually, or through short range, it might be beneficial to have like a defensive fighter squadron to prevent those bombers from getting close to your capital ships or whatever else. It's for me, for space battles, I kind of I'm in almost Jeff's camp, where a lot of these things are going to be happening over really vast distances, and a lot of times, especially if you're dealing with large scale military operations, you're going to have fleets of ships that are operating massive weapons, and they're not going to be traveling fast. And some Jeff actually does a really good job of setting this up dramatically and making it interesting and using that tension. It's hard for me to write that kind of stuff, because I'm like, I've read too much David Weber, where he has like 40 of these super dreadnoughts coming in, and they all flip sideways and shoot a million missiles, and it's all over.
I'm sure David Weber would argue I'm sure David Weber would argue there's no such thing as reading too much David Weber.
Well,
that's probably true. That's probably true.
There's no secret that David is a huge inspiration of me, but so is a lot of, I draw my inspiration from a lot of places, like Clint Eastwood. They don't make people don't write books like David Weber does anymore, and people don't make movies like Clint Eastwood does anymore. Because Clint Eastwood will have 108 minutes of buildup and 8 minutes of resolution, and those 8 minutes of resolution are better than any 8 minutes you're going to watch ever. Just think of like Unforgiven,
Right.
David kind of does the same thing. And a long time ago, I wanted to be a screenwriter, and I'd read all the screenwriting books. And one of the things that all of them would say over and over and over again is, nobody remembers the beginning of your movie when they're walking out of the theater. They just remember the ending. So if you stick the ending, people will like your movie. And if you screw up your ending, it doesn't matter how good it was to that point. You've screwed up the ending. That's all they remember.
Stephen King never learned that.
No,
and yet somehow,
well, the thing is, and that's the funny thing, is when people reference Stephen King or Brandon Sanderson or any of the big writers, J.K. Rowling, like, oh, well, they did it. I'm like, are you them? We're not them. We don't get to write bad book after bad book after bad book and get 20 million.
You need a heck of a lot more cocaine to be Stephen King.
Yeah, not that Brandon or J.K. write bad books, but Stephen King certainly does. But he made so much money in the 70s and 80s that people buy his books regardless of whether they're good or bad. And you're not them. Right. So for me, it is, my books are 40% build up, 20% subplots and things like that, and then 40% payoff. It's just the payoff is super important, and it's the last 40% of the book is the payoff of the book. And so all the build up to that has got to be, you know, really well thought out, which is why it takes me so long to write these damn things. But then,
Well, and I think too, kind of bringing it back to the historical aspect of things, like I was never a combat veteran in a sense that I was in war anywhere. I've had like fights and all that kind of stuff and like life or death situations, but I never fought in war. So to keep it accurate, I look to history and do a lot of reading of that kind of thing to make sure that I'm getting the feel of things correct. Because if you base your novel on movies or even other novels,
please
the
don't ever do
chances
that.
of you the chances of you actually getting it right are very slim, especially if you're basing it on movies. There are many novels that you can read and that will give you a good baseline for things, but unless you have a first-hand knowledge of the stories that the novels are taking homage to, then you're probably going to get something wrong. And I especially when it comes to like military quote unquote realism in the genre, I want to make it as true to um the theme or as true to the events as possible, and you really can only do that if you are a studier of actual combat history.
I love movies, and we all, three of us here wrote in the Hell and Back, the Elevator to Hell anthology that's coming out or came out by the time this airs, and that was heavily based on aliens because we love aliens. I mean, there's obviously movies that are very inspirational, but it's also very reductive because you're taking something that's already been reduced from reality, and then you're reducing it further, like a clone of a clone of a clone. You can't base your knowledge of how things are or feel off of movies. We're writers. You've got to base it off of books. You've got to base it off of firsthand accounts. You got to base it off of interviews. You got to base it off of historical fiction, historical nonfiction. I deal a lot with ships, and so I just happen to have this handy. This is my go-to
Oh yeah.
Jane's fighting ships from World War II. Because nothing replaces that knowledge of how things actually are. How many tons does a ship weigh, and why is that important? I could
That's not going to be the same in space, though.
well,
I think those details are what give realism, and especially ships are their own weird. Aircraft. We've only got 100 years of aircraft, give or take, whereas ships and shipbuilding has been around for centuries. And there's so much weird stuff that goes into shipbuilding that, yeah, there's probably not a direct parallel, but that's one of the things I kind of love about, we think 300 years in the future when we are building spacecraft. And like, I love the ideas of spacecraft that have been retrofitted over time. And you're never going to throw away a spacecraft. You're just going to retrofit it into something else, and so the kind of, history and lore that may eventually exist around that could have a huge impact or could have. I love it when that kind of stuff comes into story.
and there isn't a direct parallel per se, but it does tell you, hey, if you have a ship that's 100 meters long and is made of steel, this is how much it weighs. And plus how things are laid out. Yeah, sure, it's going to be different on a spacecraft, but I'm not going to know that you shouldn't put the head on the opposite side of the ship than the crew quarters. But they figured that out a long time ago in the in the real world. So there's lots of real world references you can use for stuff. And if you want to make it all up, you can totally make it all up. I happen to have created a system where the ships run with the decks lengthwise of the ships and gravity is down because that's how the engines work and that's how gravity works on the ships. But if I was making like a rocket propulsion based one, it would be like, office buildings kind of thing, where rocket ships, like
that's the way,
rocket ships.
that's the way most of mine are, especially in the drop trooper universe. They only have artificial gravity when they're in transition space. So when they're fighting, and have to thrust, everything is downward like a rocket. So they're all built vertically, which makes a cool effect though, because you have obviously you have elevators, but you also have like an emergency shaft that goes down the center of the ship, and it has stairs, but in zero gravity you can just, obviously go straight down it. So that's like a thing when stuff happens, your ship gets damaged, and you have to get somewhere really quick. People, swimming through zero gravity in this central shaft. I think it's a cool effect.
You can do a fireman's drop. If you ever play the video game Prey, which everybody should play that to play. But there's a whole section where you have to fight through an alien invasion in a core like that, which is in zero G. So it's fun. But I digress. One thing I wanted to bring up is changing. So one of the things, we've talked about trying to be as true to historical events as we can be, but you can also use them as a basis, or almost, not to think of alternate history, but think about something like Midway, but what if the Japanese had better screening force? Or, D-Day, but what if the German, you could set it up, like use it as a basis for something and then tweak something about it. Like we've talked about all the ways you can make it realistic, but you can also tweak something, and now you've got a different battle you can use as the basis for your story. Stalingrad, but they got into the city sooner, or things like that. Like
Stalingrad, but the Russians actually had rifles.
Right. Yeah, they had food. So those are I haven't done that. Well, no, I guess I have done that in certain times, but it's just a way, as you're thinking about and plotting out the story, you can think of different, ways you can tweak something, because it gives you a foundation of what actually happened.
Actually, I have one exactly like that. That's great.
Yeah.
It's, if you've read my books, you know who the Guild are. The Guild are this interstellar corporation that controls all the terraforming. And when I was coming up, they're only mentioned in the first book, but they're the main antagonists of the second book. And when I was coming up with all their like corporate rules and regulations, things like that, I was like, okay, well, like, how would this happen? And I realized this is EA, Electronic Arts, in a vacuum on their own planet, left alone for 1,000 years to do whatever they want. And that's how they got to be so evil as they are. Because like EA got named, like in America, got named like the worst company in America 3 years in a row. And I thought, well, what happens if you do that for 1,000 years, left unchecked with unlimited money? Oh, well, yeah, of course everything's gonna turn into like a caste system where, this is your lot in life kind of thing. And they're gonna control every single aspect of your life using spreadsheets.
Comcast and EA combined. They merged.
I kind of went that route with the corporate council. I kind of based them off a mixture of like the British shipping companies from the height of the British Empire, mixed with today's multinational corporations, that are kind of extra national and have their own. They have their own, not really foreign policy, but they have their own, things that they think will benefit them that may not be the same thing that benefit your country that they operate in. So I kind of like, what if those multinational corporations basically, were a shadow government for the whole world, which some people think they are. But
we're fast approaching that future. So
yeah, you're not far off. I like reading. Historical accounts of battles, but I like to read a whole bunch of different kind of accounts. And sometimes I don't even take the inspiration for whatever battle they're doing, but just what the characters are doing and how they're responding and how they're interacting, and basing some of my characters on that. I read a lot of Afghanistan stories from like special operators. I was trying to put together some Valor sequences. I read the Night Stalkers, and in the Company of Heroes, the Michael Durant story from Mogadishu, and
I read that
how
too.
how the 160th became a thing, and why it became a thing, and all of the training and stuff that they go through, just so if like I have a pilot character somewhere, I can use some of the the character traits that these people have in real life, and so it's not just the battles per se, but it's also the people in the battles. And if you can capture that well, then really a lot of the times the battle doesn't even make it doesn't matter. Like we've talked about before, it's the characters that matter in the story. And so if you can get those right, I like to think that I can create cool characters out of whole cloth, but the fact of the matter is that most of my characters come as an amalgamation of many different experiences and people that I've met in real life, and even the books that I've read too. And I think some of my greatest characters are the ones that I've based on real historical figures, and not just like the Patton character or like an Abraham Lincoln or George Washington or something. Like the characters that you wouldn't necessarily think of in terms of basing a character on, because everybody wants to have a Patton, a character in their book, or like a really, I don't know, good president or something like that. But sometimes I think it's the overlooked characters, the ones that are doing the grunt work. And a lot of times when you're looking at historical records on those kind of things, you get like the broad spectrum overview of a situation from like either a command level or a diplomatic kind of overview of what happened, and not the feeling and the circumstances behind even the little events that happened during the event, the battles.
Well, one thing I've learned from studying military history is that one of the most unrealistic things you can do in military science fiction is have a competent president or a overly competent commanding general.
Right.
There's always going to be somebody. Well, like, if you look at like there's always going to be somebody in the chain who got there because they're promoted to get them away from wherever they were. I mean, not to get into politics, but we all can think of an example of somebody who was almost president who got there through sheer incompetence, and sometimes in war there are generals that are really good, or admirals. What's the guy who was in charge of the U.S. Pacific Fleet? Bulldog.
Bull Halsey, you mean?
Halsey, yeah. And until he got wounded, and it actually ended up being like the best thing that could have happened, because the Japanese Imperial Fleet was totally ready to fight Halsey, and they ended up fighting somebody else, and so they misinterpreted everything the other guy did, because they put the motives, Halsey's motives, on this guy's actions, and then nothing lined up, and they ended up losing the battle. But then
that also kind of depends on what kind of war you're fighting, because World War II was a different kind of war than, say, the Great War on Terror. As far as the military leadership getting there for certain reasons.
Then you have like people like, what's that, Tommy whatever, who's like, we're going to win Iraq with the least amount of troops possible.
You mean Rumsfeld? Or
Rumsfeld, yeah.
Yeah.
And
Don Rumsfeld, not Tom.
Yeah, Don.
Anybody with any sense who heard that statement was like, you're going to get people killed, and he did.
And he fired Shinseki, and and that I think competence is sometimes in the eye of the beholder as far as history goes, unfortunately. Or you could have a person like Rick said, who's very competent in one type of warfare, but not in another, just by virtue of their career or changing circumstances.
And we're always fighting the last war too.
Right.
We were fighting World War II.
I find that the people who are most egregious in misinterpreting lessons of history are those who've never served. I'm sure there are some who misinterpreted it, but it's like Elon Musk's big thing right now is, fighters are manned fighter craft are a thing of the past. So the future is all drones. And I'm sure that makes a lot of sense to him, because he never was in the military and he doesn't understand how equipment works. Like, all he has is experience with, like, here's a multi-billion-dollar piece of equipment with 900 technicians that are all paid six figures to operate this piece of equipment and maintain it. Not, here's a 19-year-old from Kansas who the biggest thing he's ever operated was a Tonka truck, and now he's responsible for maintaining the entire thing. It doesn't really work that way in the practical world. But civilians tend to get their get their idea in their head that
Not just civilians. There's a lot of military people who think drones are going to make fighters obsolete. And I don't agree with them, but it's not just a civilian thing.
And I could be completely wrong, but I was signal in the Army, and I know how easy it is to jam these things.
I agree with you.
It doesn't make any sense that you would pin your entire hopes on a device that could be jammed by somebody with a 2 kilowatt generator and a walkie-talkie. It just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. But I could be wrong. But the point is that I think people forget the practical realism of the military, which is at the end of the day, this multi-billion-dollar weapon system has to be operated by a 19-year-old who the most important thing he's ever done in his life was read comic books.
Well, but he's also a great problem solver. He's got hands that can do things no drone can do. He or she can do, I mean, I think that probably, maybe I'm just missing or not getting exactly what you're saying, Jeff, because I think that 19-year-old, while they might not have experience, brings something to it that automation never will, which is something
I'm saying is whatever they think their drone can or cannot do,
right.
It has to be maintained by me and
okay.
You know what I mean? Who had never even worked on a car before and had a 6-week course at Fort Hood. And now I'm responsible for $9 billion piece of equipment. I mean, it has to be soldier proof. Whereas these people have all made their equipment in a lab.
Yeah.
So operated and maintained by technicians making 6 figures. Now they have to hand it over to a private who is making, 34 cents an hour.
Well, there's also the argument, though, that the drones will be a lot cheaper than the man fighters, and you can make more of them. And if one of them crashes or whatever, it's not going to be the huge loss it is if, say, an F-35 or an F-22 crashes.
Well,
like I said, I don't necessarily agree with the unmanned drone argument. I think humans are going to be a part of it and will need to, but I can see their argument, and it may make sense to them. I just don't think it's going to wind up being that way.
No. One of the big stories of, like, in fact, I was going to bring this up, like using history, you can look at different, we have the benefit of looking back, but you can see pivotal battles where technology played a huge role in, like longbowmen in the 1000s or World War I with mechanized warfare, or, we're in a transitional state right now where we're not quite sure what role drones will fully play. We don't have all the information from what's happening, there's a lot of disinformation about how effective they are.
I think a lot of it is based on what's happening in Ukraine, and people are really excited about seeing drones like flying at individual soldiers and blowing up and taking out tanks and things like that. And what they don't seem to realize is neither one of those sides has any kind of sophisticated electronic warfare technology. I mean, Russia's not even using their own radios because they're jamming Ukraine's radios, which means they're jamming their own radios for some reason.
Yeah,
we don't have that problem. We can jam everybody and still use our radios. Nobody on either side has laser defense clusters. Nobody on either side has CRAMs. It's with the 2 Arleigh Burke destroyers in the Gulf, not the Gulf, but the Suez Canal took out like 100 drones as they flew overhead toward Israel, just with their Sea-Whiz. So it's like it's like watching 2 kids play war with army soldiers, with the little plastic army soldiers, and hitting them with slingshots and thinking, wow, slingshots are the future. Well, they are when that's the best thing both sides have. I mean, if they both had Dragon anti-tank missiles and they had Sea-Whiz and they had, A-10 Thunderbolts, they'd be using those, not drones. The drones are all they got.
Well, and like things we've talked about before, like there's an economic and political perspective here too, where, Russia had a certain capability supposedly, and then we've provided Ukraine with a certain capability or whatever the West has. But in terms of story, you could look at that as like, this is a transitional technology period, and you could have characters that are trying to figure out what this means. And then you could have politicians that we only want to give people, the soldiers on the ground are dealing with certain constraints and doing the best with what they have, and this is all stuff you can play with in the story, which
I think that's a great idea too, James. Something like Crécy and Agincourt, where you had
Agincourt is what I was thinking of.
People adapting to conditions and not being stuck in in their like knights ride on horseback, and if we aren't on horseback, then we're not knights, and we're but it's the field's full of mud, so the English knights got down off their horses and fought on the ground, and between that and the longbowmen, they cut the French down because the French were slaves to tradition.
Right.
And that's you can put that in a science fiction book. Like it's kind of, I mean, I'm bringing up mine because it's what I can think of. I can't think of anybody else off the top of my head, but the bad guys, the Tawnee were stuck in the big capital ship mindset, and when they destroyed our capital ships, we had to get in another mindset, and we built these missile cutters that were small, disposable. 2 people, every one of them carried a couple of missiles, and they were like fighter bombers or torpedo bombers in the Pacific. And that was kind of midway writ large in that book. It was them using these torpedo bomber type deals to take out the enemy capital ships at very little economic cost to us, although human cost. But and the main characters those books didn't feel like it was a low cost. But as far as being able to win the war without sacrificing a huge amount of production capacity.
Yeah, and I think that's what history, being able to look back and study history from all angles, you can see those things, that these are the people that adapted and survived, and they get to write history. And the other people, I guess the French survived to some extent. But I think those are all things like really great military science fiction can give perspective on those stories, or show what it's like to live in that moment of transition or adapting to a different situation. And I still think of that 19-year-old. I guess that's why I was misinterpreting what Jeff was saying there about a drone, because I think of the 19-year-old as like our killer feature. Like the adaptability of a human in a situation, I hope and I think will continue to be. That's what makes humans great. Our ability.
Oh yeah, for sure. Because that 19-year-old is going to figure out a way to do his job with the least amount of work possible, but as effective as possible.
Exactly.
And you just can't replace humans on the battlefield. As much as they wish they could or want to. Especially when it comes to things like flying and driving, but you also can't hand over billions of dollars worth of equipment to the military and say, okay, we made this all work perfectly in a lab.
Yeah.
Now, make it work in the field.
Which is kind of, I'm having like a thematic aha moment about military science fiction. Like that's one of the really cool things about it. It's where human moments meet like the limits of technology, and also maybe like we like to think that humans are, everything's going to be perfect and it'll be a happy utopia. But, it's another thing history teaches us is that just isn't necessarily the case, and so that's what I think great military science fiction can get to. That like technology will never solve all our problems, and in a military environment is where you see it. So
it's almost like military science fiction is how soldiers and sailors in the future deal with technology and warfare.
Right.
Almost.
Maybe
you might say that.
Very ish.
We've kind of touched on that a little bit. So I'm trying to encapsulate it for the audience.
The niche of a niche, right?
Well, I do think about quite often like that conversation, Jeff, that you like to share, where the woman was like, I don't like military science fiction, and you asked her if she liked Lord of the Rings, but also I've also been thinking a lot about this agent's letter that was going around that they like blatantly did not want military science fiction, and it kind of like
that.
It kind of chuffed me, but I was like, or whatever. I'm not going to say what I won't curse on the show, but I feel like military science fiction has a big role to play in what science fiction is, so maybe we have to defend it a little bit and come up with fancy terms about it. But that's one of the things that I think history shows us. And these are kind of cool things that the genre can say, I don't know, about human experiences.
So, despite the market seemingly flooded, it's not. Mm-hmm. There's about eight writers right now who are writing actual military science fiction. Four of them are on this show right here. And there's lots of people who are writing like space opera, shoot 'em up, Firefly-esque stuff, and they call it military sci-fi. but there aren't actually a lot of military sci-fi writers, and that's why it's super important that when we write something that's military sci-fi, that it is quintessential military sci-fi. That when people read it, they know they're reading military sci-fi, because who else is going to carry this on into the future? I mean, have to sound bigger and more important than we are, but there is a legacy involved here. And if we're not carrying military sci-fi on, was it John Scalzi? I mean, who is it?
Yeah.
20 years,
Right.
who are people going to be reading going, that's military sci-fi? Because you can hardly read it now.
Well, and to your point, I think too that the doing it well and doing it right is important. And I think I think all of us get it, but I think that the people that really pay attention to actual military history and try to incorporate that in some way in their writing are also the ones that get it as well. The ones that are just trying to write a shoot 'em up battle and explosions and all that. Sure, it might be entertaining, but I think as a genre, we have the opportunity to do so much more. Just because, I mean, we've all seen our fair share of uh, the kind of anti-war, the kind of baby killer type thing, and not to the same level, but I think there is something to be said about celebrating these heroic actions and even the uh, the grim part of war in an accurate fashion. And I said that, and I didn't mean it as a like a double entendre for Jeff, but I think it's important if you really want to take it military science fiction
that's a
seriously.
great title for your next one, The Grim Side of War.
Right.
Yeah, the grim. There you go. The grim side.
Oh, thank you. I think I'm going to use that.
Grim side of battle.
Write that.
David
That down.
Weber said something that really profound to me, because people don't talk like him ever. But he was at a con, and he said that as writers, we have a responsibility to show both sides of a conflict. The heroism and the horror. And he's 100% right, because there is no. I've read too many books where it's just the horrors of war. The baby killer stuff.
Yeah.
And I'm just like,
Right.
Come on. Listen, even in the grimmest, horriblest part of World War II, heroism happened. Even in the darkest parts of Vietnam, heroism happened. You can't tell me that every single person who went to Vietnam was just this cold-blooded, ruthless killer who wanted just to kill everybody. It's just not how that works. It's not humanity. It's not how it works.
They all weren't Sergeant Barnes.
Yeah.
I think just the stories that it's like everything nowadays we deal with. It's the bad stories that rise to the top. It's the stories that make you feel bad, and so you have to want to show those stories that show the better side of human nature, even in a bad situation.
I think that all started with the fiction that came out after World War One, because World War One was such a hopeless and dehumanizing type of situation that all the military fiction, not science fiction, obviously, but just the fiction and everything that came out of it depicted war as a dehumanizing situation with no heroes and nothing but victims or victimizers.
Yeah. And this might be a good place to end this one, because we actually have another show topic, which is rah-rah war versus depression fuel when it comes to writing about military history or military science fiction. So we'll save that one, because I think we've got a lot to say there, which would be interesting to talk about. So anyway, anybody else have any last thing they wanted to throw out about using military history in your fiction before we cut things off?
You don't have to follow it one for one.
Yeah.
But it's certainly a good outline to start with.
You don't have to put the historical battles into your fiction, but you should read about all of them and have them in your head when you write it. Because if you have no idea how a real battle goes, then you're not going to write realistic battles in your military science fiction.
And I will say, I also wanted to touch on the analysis piece of it, which we have kind of talked about, from reconnaissance as foreshadowing and training and all the things that go into, like, why did one force win over another force the kind of MET-T, mission enemy terrain time element. Those are all things when it comes into studying military history that maybe even if you don't follow the exact battle, all the elements that went into, success on one side or the other are for me what makes it cool. I like to read about that stuff in a story, and that's what characters who are taking their job seriously, these are the things they're thinking about, so I like to see that kind of stuff myself. So
Well, and the last thing that I'll say too is that it's not just the fodder for the battle itself. A lot of times in the military history and the political ramifications that happened after, you can see what led to a conflict and allow you to kind of look at what you're doing with your story and go, do I just have to make it because this alien race wants to inhabit a planet, or is there something more in depth, a different problem that I can present and deal with, other than just the fighting itself and the characters, because you do get a lot of that if you're doing a lot of research into world history and military history. You get a lot of the the basics for why a conflict happened, or if this conflict happened and it precipitated a different kind of action, and that precipitated something else. And there's a lot of background information that you can get by just doing a little bit of reading and research that'll help you kind of create more background inspiration for the events of your story.
mhm. Von Clausewitz, war is diplomacy by other means.
100%.
Right. All right. Well, hey, thank you very much for hanging out with us. And if you got other ideas about military history or battles that you've read in stories that you thought the author did really well, or stories you'd love to see written about, we'd love to hear about it. So check us out in the Discord, and which is growing. We're really excited for some of the conversations that are happening there. So come check us out, and we'll see you next week. All right. Later.
Military science fiction podcast. Reaction to the system on fire.